This is Mrs. Palmer Quay, and I want to go over a few chemistry concepts to remind you of how these things relate to life as we're looking at this first few units in advanced biology. Now, I'm assuming you remember from your chemistry class, which hopefully wasn't too long ago, some basics about atoms and molecules. When we're talking atoms, we're talking things we call elements. They cannot be broken down anymore without losing their properties. And of course, an atom has a nucleus where you find protons and neutrons, and a series of electrons around in shells or layers or orbitals. And of course, when we're talking about chemical reactions, it's this outermost orbital, the valence electrons, that are the most important ones, because those are the only electrons that are available really to react with other atoms and make compounds or molecules. When we're talking about atoms, also we sometimes, especially in the medical world, talk about isotopes, which are the same elements with different masses because there are different numbers of neutrons. And often when there are different amounts of neutrons, you end up with an element that is radioactive, an isotope that is radioactive. And we use these as low levels as tracers. So here's a picture of some radioactive iodine that has been picked up by the thyroid as a tracer, trying to find out what's going on. But of course, you also know that in very high levels, radioactive isotopes can actually be used as treatment for cancer. This is not only thinking about radioactivity in the form of X-rays, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, but actual radioactive isotopes injected or implanted into someone to provide the cancer-killing radiation right to that small part of the body. The next thing I want to talk about is the difference between organic and inorganic compounds. We are organic beings, and we have many organic compounds in us, and the key thing to remember is that organic compounds have carbon and hydrogen. In fact, if you remember this acronym CHNOPS, you know the 6 most common elements in the human body. C for carbon, H for hydrogen, N nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And these molecules are going together to make macromolecules, very large molecules that I'll talk about in another video. And these macromolecules, such as protein, provide us with structure, or the carbohydrates give us energy, or our DNA give us genetic material, and many other roles. So the organic compounds in our body are found primarily as macromolecules. But we also have important inorganic compounds. We could not exist without them. So everything else, it may contain carbon or hydrogen, but it's not a large molecule based on carbon. Those are known as inorganic compounds, and those would include our important gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, various salts, and then the ions that they form when they go into solution, and acids, bases, and buffers. Now remember that ionic bonds involve electrons moving. They transfer from one atom to another. And so, our very familiar sodium plus chloride example, this electron from the sodium will transfer over, will move and be picked up, be grabbed and attracted to the chlorine, so that you end up with a positive sodium ion and a negative chloride ion. So anything that is made with an ionic bond can be commonly called a salt, and if it separates in solution into ions, it becomes known as an electrolyte because it can conduct electricity. And since your nerve impulses are basically built on electrical impulses running down your nerve cells, having ions available to conduct electricity is very important. Here are some of the key ions for health. I just talked about nerve impulses, and sodium and potassium are very, very important in nerve impulses, as is sulfate, which is not on this particular list. Calcium not only helps build strong bones and teeth, but it's also involved in muscle contraction. And so calcium keeps your heart beating, keeps your blood clotting, and that is why osteoporosis can happen if someone doesn't have enough calcium becoming available because of dietary restrictions. The body will rob calcium from the bones in order to keep the heart beating, because there's a priority here on your heartbeat over your bone strength. Magnesium is also involved in bones. Chloride is involved in water balance, and it also, just as a side note, you need to make hydrochloric acid, HCl, in your stomach to digest your food. So you need to have these chloride ions available to make hydrochloric acid so that you can digest the dinner that you had. The bicarbonate ion, or the hydrogen carbonate ion, is very important in keeping the pH of your blood at the right level. And then phosphate is also involved in a number of impulse-related activities. So a buffer system, I just mentioned the bicarbonate ion. A buffer system is a compound, such as this bicarbonate ion, that can suck up an acid or a base and keep the pH from changing. Most of our body activity ends up producing acids, and so if our body was left on its own, it would become more and more acid, and to the detriment of enzymes and many other important molecules in our body, and we would all die. So in order to keep the acids from getting out of control, we need to have buffers in the body, things that suck up those acids and keep them out of the way. And so the bicarbonate ion is one that is very active in the blood. It will, if some extra acid comes into the bloodstream, if the blood becomes more acidic, and of course something that's acid is producing hydrogen ions. It is putting more, it's giving up more hydrogen ions, it's making the solution have more hydrogen ions. The bicarbonate ion can grab it, and it, instead of becoming bicarbonate, then these two things together becomes this carbonic acid. But carbonic acid is a weak acid, and so it doesn't ionize, it doesn't give up this hydrogen that it has picked up. And so it holds the hydrogen ion out of solution and keeps the pH from lowering, from becoming more acid. If you remember, we did do, for those of you that had chemistry with me, we did do a lab activity where we had a bicarbonate ion in a test tube, and we counted how many drops it took to get the same pH change, and if we just used I think we were using hydrochloric acid, a mild solution of that, the hydrochloric acid by itself, we were trying to match the color change on the indicator, and when it took 1 or 2 drops with the acid in water, we were getting up to about 300 drops of the acid in a buffer solution. So buffers can be very powerful in keeping hydrogens, or if it's a buffer that works with a base, the hydroxide ions, out of solution so that the pH does not change. And then you have your covalent compounds, with ionic bonds and covalent bonds. And in this case, electrons are shared, or really more like fought over. Covalent compounds are more stable. They don't fall apart into ions, even though ions are extremely important when it comes to life. Covalent compounds are important because they don't fall apart. And then polar covalent bonds in water are very, very important. We'll get to that in a minute. So here we're just remembering some of those ways that polar molecules can be made. We've got hydrogen here connected with a single covalent bond. We have our oxygen here with a double covalent bond. We have our water molecule here where it's making a bent shape because you have these lone pair electrons that are pushing the bonds closer together. And then here we have a tetrahedral shape, which is shown better over here in this model, where you've got the electrons in 4 bonds off of carbon that are all trying to say equal distance away from each other. And so molecules do have a 3-dimensional shape, and it's determined by the bonds with covalent bonding. Another type of bond that really wasn't talked about much in the chemistry textbook we used, but it is very, very important when it comes to life, are hydrogen bonds. And these are bonds between hydrogen and oxygen, or between hydrogen and nitrogen, also hydrogen and fluorine. These are a attractive bond like we see between polar molecules, but there's not an actual bond formed. The electrons are not shared here. There's no electrons in the middle, but because this is more positive and this is more negative, there is an attraction, and it can be quite a strong attraction. Hydrogen bonds are what keep DNA in the double helix shape. Hydrogen bonds give proteins their particular shape, which then lead to their ability to act as enzymes. Hydrogen bonds in water are what give water its own unique properties, things like the fact that water, when it's frozen, is less dense than water as a liquid, or that water itself will have capillary attraction and will follow, one molecule will follow another. So that hydrogen bonds, even though they're not an actual sharing of electrons or transferring of electrons, are a crucial type of bond when it comes to life. I want to end by talking about the biological significance of water, why water is important for life. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that water has a high heat capacity, or specific heat was the words that we used in chemistry. And this means that you can pour lots and lots of heat at water before it raises its own temperature at all. So that, a large amount of heat goes in for a very small reaction when it comes to water. On the flip side, then, a large amount of heat can be given off by a temperature change in a small amount of water. So these work together both for absorbing heat and also for giving off heat through sweating and evaporation. They work together to prevent sudden changes in body temperature. So water is very important in homeostasis, in keeping body temperature in balance because of its high heat capacity. Water is also a polar molecule, and because it is a polar molecule, it can be a solvent to many, many compounds. Things dissolve in water. Things like our salts and those key ions that we talked about earlier, or these important gases. There are many, many things dissolved in blood, which is primarily water. And water is also a part of many places where you need some lubrication, like between the outside of the pleural cavity where your lungs are, or around the heart. Water's there to provide a friction, or very low friction, a frictionless or very low friction environment. So water as a solvent allows many of the chemical reactions to happen in your body. You need to have things in solution for them to react, to run into each other, and so water provides that place. Water is also part of many chemical reactions when it comes to hydrolysis. This is the word that we use when water is added to a macromolecule to digest it, to break it down into smaller pieces. And when we look at the macromolecules, you will see this again. So you have to have water in order to have hydrolysis, so water is part of this chemical reaction. And water has cushioning properties. This stands for cerebral spinal fluid. This is the water that runs up and down your spine and throughout your brain. It provides some cushioning against an accident or, a shaking, a jarring of those very important parts of your nervous system. And I know you're aware of water as part of the amniotic fluid that surrounds the developing baby. So these are all ways that water is involved in life processes. The scientists, of course, feel that we wouldn't have life on Earth, those that are coming from an evolutionary standpoint. Water was the reason we had life, and they're very, very interested in trying to find water at other places around the universe because all these ways that water is essential for the life processes. So this covers some of the important things that I wanted you to remember. You think about how chemistry is connected to life. The next video that goes along with this series will talk about the macromolecules in greater detail.